We are now live with a new installment of the Expert Analysis webinar series, Lebanon, a Nation in Turmoil.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alan Schneider, and I am the director of the B'nai B'rith World Center here in Jerusalem. Welcome to today's webinar, where we will discuss ongoing developments in Lebanon and the wider region. It's almost exactly 3 months ago today, on August 4th, that the world was shocked by the colossal explosion that occurred at a warehouse in the port of Beirut. The blast killed over 200 people, injured over 6,000, and left over 300,000 people homeless. This tragedy took place in an environment already charged by mass demonstrations, public unrest, and a deep distrust in the political elite and institutionalized sectarianism reflected in the method of governance in the country, under which the president is required to be Maronite, the prime minister a Sunni, and the speaker of the parliament a Shiite. In examining the state of affairs that Lebanon finds itself in today, we are delighted to be joined by an expert panel of guests from the US, Israel, and Europe. Dr. Michael Rubin is resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. An expert on Middle Eastern affairs, on security, politics, and religion, Michael is a former Pentagon official who has previously lived in post-revolution Iran, Yemen, and Iraq. Orna Mizrahi is Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv. Orna's research fields include the Lebanese arena, the decision-making process in Israel. And she has a long career within the Israeli security establishment, having spent 26 years in the IDF and 12 years in the National Security Council. Elise Coolegem is Senior Policy Advisor on Middle Eastern and North African Affairs to the European Conservatives and Reformists group in the European Parliament. Her areas of expertise are the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Gulf region, and counterterrorism. She previously worked as a consultant to various civil society organizations in the Middle East. Thank you all three for joining us. Now, I'd like to begin our discussion by asking all three panelists to help me with a fundamental definition. Is Lebanon an independent state in your view, or is it a vassal country of Iran imposed through the bayonets of Hezbollah? Orna, if you could go first and give us your assessment.
Thank you, Alan. First, let me welcome our audience and say good day. And I'll start by saying that about the question if Lebanon is independent, there are different approaches in Israel. There are some that say that actually Lebanon is Hezbollah, but I think differently. I think that Lebanon Lebanon is a state in turmoil and very in great disturbance, triple crisis, the economic, political, healthcare, and this explosion that happened 3 months ago. But still, it's a state that has not only one force that dominates it, not just Hezbollah. There are also other forces in Lebanon. Hezbollah is for sure powerful. It's got its own military, semi-military, force, militia, we call it militia, that has very sophisticated weapons, most of it missiles, also ground forces, special ground forces, etc., etc. But he's got political influence inside Lebanon, and some say that he is the dominant in Lebanon. But still, there are other forces. We have that Lebanon is a sectarian state, so there are the other sects, the elites of the other sects that are involved. And I think that one of the main things that build this powerful position of Hezbollah is the fact that since 2005-6, they are with alliance with the big Maronite Christian party. the party of the President Aoun and his family. And this connection with the Christian makes and some more parties makes him so powerful and influential in the political system. But these elites are there, and they take part in the political game. And we have also the other security apparatus. It's not just Hezbollah. We have the Lebanese army. Some will say that Hezbollah is controlling the Lebanese army. He's got influence on the Lebanese army, but he's not controlling it. And about the foreign policy, we see that Hezbollah would like that Lebanon will be part of the Shiite axis. And Nasrallah was just saying a few months ago in one of his speeches that the best way for Lebanon is to leave the West away and to be connected to the East, to the Shiite axis, to have connection with Syria, Iran, Iraq. But this is not the reality. Lebanon is very much connected to the West, asking for Western aid, and the Iranian politics are not the one that conducted the Lebanese policy. So I must say that Lebanon, Hezbollah is very strong, but still Lebanon is a kind of independent state, in a very still disturbance, but it's an independent state. But we have to look at it that it wouldn't become a non-dependent state.
Thank you, Orna. Michael, can we have your assessment of that topic?
Let me answer it this way. Hezbollah is a cancer. Several years ago, I mean, in a decade ago, and back in 2006 at the time of the war, we could say that it was stage 1 or more likely stage 2. At this point, it's grown throughout the system so that it's clearly probably stage 4. Now, that doesn't mean that Lebanon is a terminal case yet, but it's going to take some massive intervention in order to rid the Lebanese system of Hezbollah. And Orna had mentioned the rise of Michel Aoun, for example. The biggest difference between 2006 and today is back in 2006, both Israel and the United States sought to differentiate during the fighting between Lebanon and Hezbollah. But when you have Michel Aoun, the president, a Christian, who is clearly sympathetic or in alliance with Hezbollah, that puts the whole Lebanese system in jeopardy. Now, I'm an Iran watcher by training, and one of the issues that I look at most is that while we often think about Hezbollah as mostly a product of southern Beirut and South Lebanon, through groups like Khatam al-Anbiya, the economic wing of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Iran is also trying to create a buffer zone for Hezbollah and other like-minded groups in the north of Lebanon, along the border of Latakia. The last point I would make is that within the US intelligence community and within US diplomacy, there's always been a core of analysts who have suggested, no, Hezbollah has evolved. It's become a Lebanese nationalist organization. But when you look at the fighting in Syria during the civil war and the role that Hezbollah played in there, they were acting as proxies for Iran. What they were doing had nothing to do with Lebanese nationalism. And so that theory that Hezbollah has evolved to become more Lebanese nationalist should be put to rest once and for all.
Michael, thank you very much. Elise, could you add to what we've heard before from Orna and Michael?
Right. No, thank you. I think it's a very good question. From a European perspective, it's a bit mixed. On the one hand, Europe does view Lebanon as an independent country, as a strategic partner with a thriving, pluralistic, and democratic society. As mentioned before by yourself and the previous speakers, it has a political system that ensures a type of balance of representation between the various communities. On the other hand, you also hear the voices coming out of Lebanon that express a real concern of the growing power and Iranian interference in Lebanon's political system. And Europe can also not pretend that it does not hear those voices. So the EU will say they have their reservations, but they would never express these publicly or openly, just because they don't want to upset any of their relations with Iran, which are very tense, but also not to kind of shift or, upset the fragile balance that exists in Lebanon. However, I would say in the European Parliament where I work, it's a bit of a different arena. There you do hear the different voices, and there they would actually say openly or raise their concerns openly with a High Representative Borrell or his predecessor before Mrs. Mogherini, and members of the ECR group have done that consistently, and they will consistently do so also in the future. So I would say, there are European concerns, but if they are, they will be raised behind closed doors, or alternatively, you'll hear them in the European Parliament.
Mm. Well, thank you very much. I want to move on to a related question, maybe closely related to what we've just been discussing. And that is, what is the foreign policy, the practical foreign policy approaches now of the US, EU, and Israel vis-a-vis Lebanon? And first of all, I'll ask Michael first, if you could just go into a little more detail about how the US today, considering we talked about whether Lebanon is independent or not, but how is the US government, what is their approach today to Lebanon? And at least then if you could address the EU, and finally Orna on Israel, how is the Israeli government viewing Lebanon today?
Well, thank you, Alan. I'll quote from the Congressional Research Service, which, as you know, is the bipartisan research arm of Congress, which is meant to be able to answer these questions without politics and without polemics. What the Congressional Research Service says is that US policy in Lebanon aims to counter the influence of Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah, secure Lebanon's border against the flow of weapons and militant groups, and preserve domestic stability. Now, in pursuit of these goals, the United States has supported the Lebanese armed forces. However, as you know, and as your audience knows, there is a growing debate in Congress about whether the Lebanese armed forces, which was once in the wake of the Civil War, the true multi-confessional institution which Lebanese nationalists look to, whether it still maintains that sort of pedigree, or whether it's been co-opted by Hezbollah. When I met with the commander of the Lebanese armed forces a couple years ago, he was Joseph Aoun, who's no relation to Michel Aoun. He was in complete denial about the presence of Hezbollah infiltrating the Lebanese armed forces. That might be an excuse which some diplomats are willing to accept, but within the halls of Congress, it's creating a much deeper policy debate about how we should support Lebanon, whether we should support Lebanese independence, and or whether we should throw in the towel. And I would just say in closing that the debate actually gets a little bit more broad, because when we look at, for example, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's threat to pull the embassy out of Baghdad, it's clear that he's looking at Iraq policy through the lens of the past decade and a half of US policy towards Lebanon, where people would say, no, we have to engage only to have Hezbollah's influence grow. I'm sorry, one last point is none of this would have been possible had it not been for the complete ineptitude of the opposition to Hezbollah. But we can discuss that further after Elise talks.
Okay, Elise?
Right, so EU's relations with Lebanon cover a variety of topics, from close political, economic, and trade relations, and also people-to-people contacts. The EU views, as mentioned earlier, Lebanon as a strategic partner with which it can cooperate closely on security challenges and counterterrorism, but also to create further growth and jobs in Lebanon. So, and the EU always likes to state that the EU-Lebanese partnership is based on common values and interests. The EU provides funding to Lebanon through its various funding mechanisms, and they pump billions of euros into Lebanon in support of its economy and local governance. The EU's engagement with Lebanon also concerns Syrian migrants that have fled after the Syrian crisis, and around 1 million or so are now registered with UNHCR. So the EU provides funding to help Lebanon care for these migrants as well. And the EU also provides financial support to the Palestinians in Lebanon that are registered with UNRWA. Mm-hmm. So with the billions of euros flowing into Lebanon from Europe, one actually may question how successful is the EU in achieving its many aims, such as promoting security and fighting counterterrorism, if one thinks of the Hezbollah angle. Another question would also be, how successful is the EU in promoting accountable local governance and helping the country create jobs and prosperity for its citizens? And so many of the people have recently gone out on the streets to complain about the corruption and the failing economy. So I would say, Europe's relations with Lebanon are very diverse. They cover many aspects, but perhaps they should also be reviewed in the current context and, see how better they could achieve the stated aims that the EU has.
Thank you. Orna, can you tell us what the current view of Lebanon is from Israel, how the Israeli government views our neighbor to the north?
Okay, with accordance to what I have said before, I think that in Israel, there is still a distinction between Hezbollah and Lebanon. And the policy towards Hezbollah is not the same as the policy towards the state of Lebanon. And I think that the negotiations on the demarcation of the maritime borders are a proof of that. That Israel now talking about Lebanon as the main enemy threat on Israel on one hand, and on the other hand, as negotiation with the Lebanese state. So the Israeli policy still makes this distinction between Hezbollah. Hezbollah is the main threat. Now it's the main military conventional threat on Israel because of its military capabilities. With the aid of Iran, of course, the coordination with Iran, all of that makes him the main threat on Israel. And regarding Lebanon, and one thing important to say that Israel wages a campaign, political, military, and also cognitive campaign against Hezbollah. And the goals are, of course, to deter, to weaken, and the main goal for the long run is to disarm Hezbollah from his weapons, that he wouldn't be so the threat for us. Now about Lebanon, apart from Hezbollah, you can agree with me that there are not a real substantial disagreement between Israel and Lebanon, because Israel was withdrawing at 2000. And after the Second Lebanese War, also Israel withdrew from Lebanon, and the UN marked the blue line. And there are few disputes along the border on other issues, maybe the Palestinian refugees and things like that. But if Israel and Lebanon would come to the table, they can solve it very easily. If I would recommend and say what Israel's policy should be, and I think that this is the main basis of the Israeli policy, is that Israel wants to see Lebanon as a stable, prosperous country that is not in the hands of Hezbollah. This is what lead the Israeli policy now. Of course, in times of war, it's different. Because of the fact that the Hezbollah's weapons are inside the civilian population, it's a big question how the IDF is going to act during this war. And for sure, there are lots of Israeli generals suggest that Israel should say during wartime, Hezbollah is there, Lebanon is Hezbollah, and we have to wage war against all of Lebanon and not just Hezbollah, because we can't on wartime make this differentiation between the two.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Orna. So I would like to move back to Elise and ask you, how did the explosion in Beirut impact on the EU in general and the special role of France and its long historic connection to Lebanon in mediating the situation there? So What has happened since August 4th in that regard, vis-a-vis Lebanon and the UN and Lebanon and the EU?
Right. Well, first of all, I think, like everyone, Europe was shocked at the sheer damage that the explosion caused. Of course, the many loss of lives and the many wounded. And Europe really extended its full solidarity with the Lebanese people, who had already been going through so much before. The EU called for an independent inquiry into the explosion and mobilized 63 million euros in immediate humanitarian and crisis response, and sent search and rescue and medical teams to Lebanon to help support the Lebanese efforts, or help the Lebanese authorities in their efforts. High Representative Borrell also underscored President Macron's statements that Europe wishes to see the formation of a capable, representative, and accountable Lebanese government, which delivers on the credible reform agenda that has been demanded by so many Lebanese citizens. So focusing on France specifically, like you mentioned, France and Lebanon share historic ties. After the Beirut explosion, Macron visited Lebanon twice and put pressure on the Lebanese leaders to form a government swiftly. He proposed a roadmap and set deadlines for the Lebanese leaders to take action on various fronts. And he said he would come back in December to check on the progress. However, as we may know, at the end of September, so over a month ago, the Lebanese political establishment missed Macron's deadline to form a government. And then Macron accused the Lebanese leadership of betraying their obligations and even committing collective treason for failing to form a government. He even sent a very pointed warning to Hezbollah, saying that they should not think that they are more powerful than they are, and that they should respect all Lebanese. And this comes, of course, after the many reports that Hezbollah had been stalling the formation of the Lebanese government. So like I mentioned earlier, these comments contain some of the strongest wording that we've heard coming out of Europe and France especially. And I think it's definitely interesting to watch how this all will play out. If France may change its policy, more critical tone or rhetoric towards Lebanon. And if France does, what will the impact be on the EU's rhetoric and language and policy then to Lebanon in that regard as well? So I think it will definitely kind of be interesting to see how this all plays out.
That's a work in progress for sure. Orna, I want to turn back to you. As you know, we all know, and to the surprise of many, negotiations have recently begun between Israel and Lebanon that would delineate the maritime border between the two countries and allow the development of energy resources in this long disputed area. Now, should we view this as a chapter in the peace fest that was brokered by the current US administration between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain and Sudan? Can you tell us the significance of a possible agreement, what the significance is, and whether Hezbollah could play the spoiler and prevent any agreement from being implemented?
Okay, you have mentioned two reasons for that. You have mentioned the new atmosphere in the region, and I think you're right. Maybe the new atmosphere influenced the decision, but there were more reasons. There were also the American pressure. I think that the Trump administration wanted to have one more achievement in the region, and to come and say that they also have this negotiation between Israel and Lebanon, and the Americans are putting much pressure on the Lebanese side, even on these days. But I think that the main factor that influenced and caused the Lebanese to come to the negotiation was, of course, the awful situation in Lebanon, as we have described before. And it's not just the awful situation of Lebanon, the state, it's also the distress that Hezbollah is under. And I think that one of the things that we have to mention is that after the explosion, and we are talking about the phase after the explosion and the implications, that the criticism on Hezbollah from the Lebanese public was more open and, than before. And it was a new atmosphere in Lebanon against Hezbollah. And you can add on it the distress that they have because of their budgetary problems, the fact that Iran is under the sanction, the American pressure with the direct sanction on Hezbollah, the political pressure on them with more countries coming to say that it's international terrorist organization and things like that. So the organization is under pressure, and this brought him to agree for the opening of the negotiation with Israel, because the attempts to do so, we know about decade of attempts to do so. And so why now? I think it's because the distress of Hezbollah and Lebanon, both of them. About your question, if he's going to be the spoiler, I think he is the main spoiler on this in these negotiations. We have the Americans on one side that pressuring the Lebanese, the other political figures in Lebanon, to come with more goodwill to the negotiations. But on the other hand, the Hezbollah is trying was trying to contain the negotiation, and they asked that there will be only military people, that there wouldn't be direct negotiation, that they won't talk about anything but the maritime border, the EEZ between the two states. And they are going to keep an eye on what is happening. If they see that it's going to a place that they don't like it to go to there, I think that they are going to try to jeopardize it again. If the agreement is reached, I think it's going to bring us stability in the region. Because international companies are going to come along the shore, the Lebanese and Israeli shore, and will have these economic implications. But for the economy of Lebanon, I would say that the implications are for the long run and not going to change anything in the Lebanese economy for the immediate period.
But as you say, but if we have companies, international companies, and operating in the Mediterranean, in the oil rigs in the area, that will bring more stability and peace to the region.
Yeah, I think it will be one more reason for Hezbollah, at least if it's going to develop over there. They will have to think second time if they are going to start something towards Israel, or So I think it can bring us to have some more stability in the region, and this is the main issue, and not the economy issue.
Thank you very much. I have a follow-up question, and maybe I'll ask Michael first if he tackle this one. That in your assessment, why has there been no war or major flare-up between Israel and Lebanon since the Second Lebanon War? And this is despite the targeting of Hezbollah Expeditionary Force in Syria by Israel, and the U.S. targeted killing of Iranian Brigadier General and major regional troublemaker Qasem Soleimani. Is Hezbollah deterred, as Israeli leaders would lead us to believe, or are there other considerations afoot?
To answer that question, Alan, I think you need to look at the region a little bit more holistically. People will argue that if Israel or the United States were to strike at Iran's nuclear program, the major immediate retaliation would be from Lebanon using the 100,000 plus missiles and rockets which Hezbollah has acquired to rain down on Israel. Now, if you accept that, and most analysts do, if Israel and Lebanon, if Hezbollah were to launch its missiles at Israel, that would lower the barrier or the cost for any Israeli strike on Iran. If you're already suffering the cost of that sort of retaliation, why not then take out the fundamental problem, which from many people's viewpoint is the Iranian nuclear program? And so the fact that Iran is worried and wants to use those Hezbollah rockets as a deterrence is actually stopping Hezbollah on their own from launching any serious sort of 2006 strike on Israel. But here's the problem. If you look at Iran's unmanned aerial vehicle program, they've bragged openly that they've not only provided Hezbollah with the unmanned aerial vehicles, the drones, but they've also provided Hezbollah with the means to manufacture them. That means that in any future attack using drones, you could have a situation where there would be just enough plausible deniability to sort of figure that the Iranians could game the system. You also have a consideration that if Iran offers an olive branch, not a sincere one, but a rhetorical one, such as what they did during the Clinton administration with the so-called dialogue of civilizations, that you could have tremendous American wishful thinking and corollary pressure upon Israel not to do anything if provoked. If I may just very quickly, though, throw a little bit of pessimism onto Orna's analysis. The US role in the maritime dispute, frankly, two things are at play here within Congress. First of all, it seems in Congress and in the State Department to almost be an afterthought. Assistant Secretary of State David Schenker has always been very interested in Lebanon, but when you see the Secretary of State's travels, he's going to places like Sudan, which seems to be where the major focus is. Then you have the issue of what if there is a demarcation? I think the question which you're going to have to deal with in Congress is to assume that the state of Lebanon would have sway over that maritime territory that's demarcated in its favor. Would be like to assume that international oil companies could strike a deal with the Palestinian Authority with regard to perhaps some of the waters off the Gaza coast without having Hamas try to come in and at the very least charge protection money and at the very most try to assume it for themselves. So this is going to become really a hot potato in Congress if it's successful, simply because people are going to raise questions about whether this demarcation is actually going to benefit Hezbollah more than the Lebanese government.
Well, thank you, Mike. Do any of the panelists want to refer to that question that I had? I asked Michael about why has Hezbollah been deterred? Orna, do you have a?
Yeah, I have a short answer and a long one. The short answer is that Hezbollah is for sure deterred. There is deterrence, and I would say that there is mutual deterrence between Israel and Hezbollah since the Second Lebanese War in 2006. But the long explanation will be that we have to look to distinguish between two main periods. I think the first period, the after-war period, since 2006 to 2013, Hezbollah was surprised by the implications of the war, the devastation in Lebanon, the damage for his forces and for Lebanon, the state, the destruction in the Dahya, and they were very much occupied in the rehabilitation of their abilities. But one thing to remember is that along all the period, what they were doing is trying to rebuild up their military capabilities. And at first, Israel was not paying attention to that too much, of course, with the help of the Iranians. And then the second period, since 2013, was the beginning of the involvement of Hezbollah in Syria. And this changed the course of events, because now they were very much involved in there. They had casualties over there. They had to explain to the Lebanese public why they are fighting in Syria, when they are saying that they have this buildup of weapons to fight Israel. And the fact that they were occupied in Syria made them not do anything along the Lebanon border and keep it quite quiet. Now we have to look at the last 2 years. If I have time for that, please, Alan, tell me if I have to stop. I'll say that what is happening is that we are in some kind of deterrence equation. Israel understand that we couldn't let what happened in Lebanon happen in Syria, and the IDF is striking in Syria for thousands of time on the Iranian forces, the Hezbollah forces, and also Assad forces if there is something that is not right. But the IDF is not attacking in Lebanon since 2006, at least not a big military exposed actions. And the Hezbollah wanted to save this deterrence equation. And lately, in the last year, we have seen that even they try to extend it. And when Nasrallah was saying that if his activists in Syria are going to be killed, he's going to kill Israeli soldiers along the Israeli border. And this is a kind of a change. He tries to extend the equation and say, you can't hurt us on the Syrian to restrict the Israeli action in Syria and say that they are going to do something on the Lebanese border. But he failed to do so. But we are on that chapter. It's not finished yet, because for a few months there is tension on the north. Nasrallah was saying that he's going to revenge the killing of one of his activists on the 20th of July, last July, but they failed to do so. And I think that they are very much contained. And actually, I had to start with it. As we understand, our assessment is that Hezbollah doesn't want war now with Israel. It doesn't need it. Its troubles. It's not just the involvement in Syria. It's what's going in Lebanon. It's the awful situation in Iran, the American sanctions. Maybe if the administration in the US is going to be changed, maybe something will be changed also on this issue. But for now, there is no interest, not from the side of Hezbollah and not from the side of Iran, as its patron, to wage war towards Israel. And this is why they are not retaliating against what Israel is doing in Syria.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I wonder if part of this is also the recent uncovering by the US that Hezbollah has been moving ammonium nitrate, which is the same chemical that caused the explosion in Beirut, from Belgium to France, Greece, Italy, Spain, and Switzerland, and that they're suspected still to be storing the material in Europe. Has this put a crimp also into Hezbollah style in Europe? And I want to open this up to the panel. Any of you want to comment on it? I mean, are they being followed and contained much more actively by the US and even by Europe, France was mentioned before, because of their involvement in Europe seems to have been, the cover seems to have been blown.
Right. I think, well, first of all, I would like to say, yes, these have been the US statements on this, but France and Spain have actually denied having any knowledge of this. So these two European countries, at least, say they have no knowledge and you know, therefore they wouldn't take any action, let's say. You know, of course, when it comes to Hezbollah, there has been some kind of momentum in Europe with designating Hezbollah in its entirety. Or at least the calls have been there. At the moment, the EU's policy is to only designate the military or so-called military wing and not the so-called political wing, which is actually a distinction that Hezbollah, of course, denies themselves. They say it's one and the same organization, but the EU continues with, you know, with this difference. But we have seen kind of some movement in Europe, and I think that's, you know, again, very interesting to watch and see how it will continue.
And did you think that that's because of this, the activity of Hezbollah in Europe, whether it's denied by these countries or not? Is that why? I mean, we've seen Lithuania, Estonia designating you know, both parts of Hezbollah as terrorists, and we know that the Czech Parliament has. I'm sorry about that. The Czech Parliament has passed a motion urging the government to do the same. Latvia has been vocal. So do you think this is part of it? Well, I mean, a lot of people, you know, believe that the blast in Beirut was caused by Hezbollah. So is this why we're seeing this trend in Europe now?
Well, I think, you know, with all the countries that you've mentioned, I think it's very important to note that actually Germany designated Hezbollah in its entirety in April of this year. This is really significant because Germany is one of the heavyweights among the member states. I would say, you know, I mean, we have to be honest that the US's role has been, you know, instrumental in what we're seeing now in Europe, with more countries kind of designating or calling for the full designation of Hezbollah. And they have really been, let's say, opening the Europeans' eyes to this. So I think as, let's say, we'll have these kind of information saying that Hezbollah is active and planning these, how do you say, is involved in the criminal activities in Europe as well, and shifting explosives around, there will be also an increased pressure on European governments to take a stance and, you know, publicly also denounce it, and then ask for a full ban. You know, we'll have to see if this momentum will be kept up, especially also with the new US administration, as the US has really played a key role in this. But lastly, I would also like to, and I think this is very important, when we talk about the EU's designation of Hezbollah in its entirety, this will have to be a member state policy priority driven. So it's normally, you know, sometimes things happen that on EU level, the EU decides something and then the member states will have to implement it. When it comes to this, I mean, it really will have to come from the member states. The member states will have to put pressure on the EU to say, you know, now we're going to go for the full ban. Of course, it involves unanimity in the Foreign Affairs Council, but I think, you know, this is going to be the key. If we're going to see any change to the EU's policy, it will have to be member state, or it will be member state driven.
Michael, could you provide some insight maybe into that, about what the State Department and the members of Congress are doing to nudge the EU to outlaw Hezbollah in its entirety? I think you may have touched upon that in your book.
To some extent, perhaps a little bit, but if you want to understand where the United States is coming from, let's use an analogy to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran. For years, there had been a debate about whether to sanction the IRGC in its entirety or not, whether that would be too provocative and perhaps precipitate more conflict. one of the reasons why the United States ended up doing this is because Americans are a litigious lot. And given the tremendous financial holdings of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, just like Hezbollah has tremendous financial holdings, this means that if anyone is victimized by an IRGC, or in this case, a Hezbollah terrorist attack, that people can seek resource from any business which is part of Hezbollah or does business with Hezbollah. In the case of going back to the Iran analogy, the French car automobile manufacturer Peugeot had a deal, I believe, with the Iranian automotive company Paykan. And what this would mean is if there had been a terrorist attack in Iraq that killed Americans, that the victims, the family members of that terrorist attack could not only sue the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which would likely go nowhere because Iran would never pay up, but they could sue Peugeot. Now, while the Europeans and European governments oftentimes get upset with the degree of American sanctioning, especially when Americans involve ourselves in unilateral sanctions, when I talk to leaders of European corporations, what they will say is, look, we know our politicians tell us not to abide by this, but ultimately, we are much more liable to our shareholders than we are to diplomats, and therefore we have no choice, even if we don't like it, to apply. And this is sort of a dynamic which goes back to the Clinton administration back in 1994 and 1995, when the United States started imposing unilateral sanctions. So what I would argue is the United States is going to pressure Europe, and that pressure will be sustained. But at the same time, we're also willing, Congress is willing to utilize unilateral sanctions. Now, two more quick points, if I may. In the wake of 9/11, of the September 11th, 2001 terror attacks, by executive order, George W. Bush gave the Treasury Department the ability to designate terrorists in addition to the State Department. But when the Treasury Department does it, it's much more technocratic, much more objective, and it doesn't take into account diplomatic feelings. This is one of the reasons why the Treasury Department list is about 13 times as long as the State Department list. The last point I would make is we can look at what Hezbollah has been doing in Europe, but another focus of American pressure has been what Hezbollah has been doing in West Africa, and to a lesser extent, South America. Lebanon's greatest export has always been its people. And so you have huge diaspora communities across West Africa, which have been co-opted by Hezbollah and have been the linchpin, for example, in cocaine smuggling from South America through West Africa into Europe. And so Europe and the United States will certainly cooperate and coordinate on this. And we also have had court cases in the United States and Canada looking at some of the Hezbollah black marketeering and money laundering and weapons laundering, where you take stolen cars, you ship them to West Africa, you sell them, you then in Togo or Benin cash that money in and buy weaponry. That's the type of stuff that the United States is also cracking down on. The point of this is what's happening with sanctions in Europe is just one side of a multifaceted show, which really proves what a global presence Hezbollah has, not just militarily, but economically as well. And the key to suffocating Hezbollah is to go after that economy.
Well, thank you, Michael. Orna, I wanted to ask you, are you aware of any efforts by Israel also to engage Europe on this issue of Hezbollah and banning Hezbollah? Are we very active, or is it not one of our main focuses of diplomatic activity with Europe?
No, it's one of the main topics on the agenda when there are meetings with the Europeans. And I would say that there are two issues that Israel is engaged with Europe along the years. The first one is, of course, the intelligence cooperation. We share our intelligence about Hezbollah actions, activists, etc., not just Hezbollah, other terrorist organizations. And this is one aspect. The other aspect is, of course, the political campaign that Israel is waging also in Europe, that they will come and do this את ההכרזה כארגון טרור.
Declaration.
In his entirety, yeah. That he is a terror organization in it is that distinction that he is a terror organization in his entirety. Israel is doing a lot about that. It's very important. We understand that it's very important that all of the European countries and the EU will understand that. And we have some progress on it with the Americans, of course. Elise talked about Germany, but also Britain is the one that came on. Holland is a long time ago, and now we have seen more countries, Estonia, I think, Czechoslovakia, and I hope there will be others. So the Hezbollah, as I said, Hezbollah is the main military threat for Israel nowadays. So, of course, it's on the top of the agenda, of the Israeli agenda, with the political policy that Israel is waging.
Thank you very much. We're coming towards the end of this hour, and I think we have maybe about 2 minutes left for each of our panelists. And what I wanted to ask each of you is, is just really to give you an opportunity to share your general expectations for the future of Lebanon. We've spent the last almost an hour talking about Lebanon, what's happened there, but how do you envision the future and its relationship with the US, Israel, and the EU going into the future? So maybe we'll start with Elise, and then Orna, and ending with Michael.
Thank you. Yes, I think we will continue seeing Europe pumping millions or billions of euros into Lebanon, while at the same time raising the need for much needed reforms and for any future government to listen to the demands of the people. At the same time, Europe will not want to impact the delicate balance that exists in Lebanon. Therefore, they will not confront directly Hezbollah, or they will not wish to kind of take a very strong stance also against the Iranian interference in Lebanon, at least publicly. At the same time, I think it will really be interesting to keep a close eye on Macron's positioning towards any future Lebanese government, and see if we continue to see or to hear critical voices coming out of Paris, which may then also potentially translate into similar critical voices coming from Brussels and other European countries. Lastly, I would say the Europeans do wish the Lebanese will, that they live and thrive in a democracy and not return to the dark days of the civil war. We have seen the Lebanese people's resilience time and again during the popular protests and in times of other internal crises. And their true determination recently or over the last year to unite under a Lebanese flag and to call for an end to sectarian policies. That is quite extraordinary. And the EU will definitely keep on supporting those Lebanese efforts or the efforts of the Lebanese people. Lastly, I would like to say, the members of the ECR group will continue also to support the Lebanese citizens and their demands for an accountable government, an end to corruption, and for the stability to return to Lebanon. And, we also support very much the ongoing negotiations between Lebanon and Israel regarding the maritime demarcations. And if we may dream of a perfect world, I would say we also very much would support a peace agreement, between Israel and Lebanon one day that really serves the stability and the interests of both countries.
Well, I'm sure many people in Israel are hoping for that as well. So thank you, Elise. Orna, would you address that?
I'm not sure I can do it in 1 minute, but I'll try. I think it's very difficult to predict something in the Middle East and especially in Lebanon, but in assessment that we have done lately, we have come to that there are 4 scenarios that we can talk about to the future of Lebanon. The first one is what was is what will be. the same as now. And I don't see the European countries, as Elise was saying, are coming and bringing billions of dollars to Lebanon. They are quite cheap about it, and they want some reforms. I don't see the Lebanese promoting this reform. So it can be for a while, and then it can bring the other scenarios that I'm going to talk about. The second one is the positive scenario, that will see a gradual positive change in Lebanon, functional government, new one, better than before. Hezbollah is not so dominant in what the government is doing. Money coming from the West, etc. So this is the positive scenario. But there are also two very negative scenarios, in my opinion at least. The third one is that there is going to be a forceful takeover of Hezbollah. If Hezbollah will come to decide that he doesn't like what is going on and is on too much pressure, maybe they will decide that they are going to take over and control and really control Lebanon. I think that today they prefer not doing it because if with the controlling Lebanon comes the responsibility, and they don't want responsibility for this disturbed state. The fourth one is maybe we are going to a new civil war and chaos in Lebanon. Maybe scenario that can come out of this Hezbollah's attempt to take over, or other deterioration because violence, etc. And so we are going to have another civil war in Lebanon, but I hope that we wouldn't get to that. About Israel-Lebanon relations. First, I must say that I hope that we are not going to have another war, because although I said before that there is no interest for Hezbollah, Iran, and even Israel to go to a war nowadays, I think that there are some scenarios of deterioration or miscalculation that can bring us to that point. If Hezbollah decides to revenge and then killing Israeli soldiers and Israel is retaliating, or even if Hezbollah decide to divert the attention from what's happening inside Lebanon and do something against Israel. And also Israel can decide that Israel now see the precision missiles program as a main threat, and maybe Israel will decide that this is the time to do something against this program, and it's going also, it can deteriorate the situation. So I hope we wouldn't get there, and that both sides will contain, and as they do till now, and we wouldn't have war. About the negotiations, I hope that we will reach some kind of agreement. I don't see it happening so soon. I was more optimistic at first, but I see that there are some complications now. And then there is the Hezbollah as a spoiler. But if we will have an agreement, it could build a new atmosphere between the two states, and I hope that this will be the scenario and not the others that I have just mentioned.
Thank you. Michael, can you take just the next couple of minutes to wind up this discussion?
Absolutely. Well, I'm a historian by training, which means I get paid to predict the past. And most of my critics would say I only get that right about 50% of the time. So woe to me trying to predict the future. But I'm going to give 3 pessimistic points and 1 optimistic point. First of all, we have to acknowledge the failure of the Lebanese elites. Hezbollah has thrived in part because the Lebanese elites have been more concerned with battling themselves than with taking on the threat which Hezbollah poses. I worry about wearing down the resolve in Europe. We saw this after the tribunal, after the assassination of Rafik Hariri, and journalist Michael Young has written, Lebanese journalist Michael Young has written about this in great detail. Sometimes we're willing in the short term to make short-term concessions to put off the threat of violence, which do long-term harm. Frankly, Condoleezza Rice and the Bush administration in which I worked also were responsible for this with regard to the 2008 Doha Accord. What I worry about is Hezbollah after the Syrian civil war is coming back battle-hardened. Israel withdrew completely from Lebanese territory in the year 2000. The United Nations certified that withdrawal. And for a generation, Hezbollah was all bark and little bite. They hadn't really engaged in the field the way they had once. But now you have Hezbollah, which has had a trial by fire in Syria, and both Lebanon and the rest of the wider region is going to be paying the price for this as these forces are active not only in Lebanon, but perhaps elsewhere in the Middle East. The optimistic note, however, would be, look, regime change is coming to Iran, and it's got nothing to do with the maximum pressure campaign. It's got nothing to do with wishful thinking. It's got to do with the longevity of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. And when Ali Khamenei dies, it's uncertain what's going to happen. Will the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps really consolidate control? Will there be a smooth transition to a new supreme leadership? What I would imagine is that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is going to become so inwardly focused. And when I say inwardly focused, focused on Tehran, even at the expense of Iran's periphery, that it may lead them to take the eye off the ball in Lebanon. And that may provide some new opportunities for Lebanese, for Israelis, and for the broader moderate Arab community.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you all very much for this very insightful discussion. I hope that it's been enriching for all of our viewers. And if you enjoyed this program and would like to see more, please look us up on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and YouTube. Thank you all for tuning in today, and stay safe. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Take care.
Bye.